provided me with the opportunity to go out and to seek and try to establish a relationship with a firm that consists us in addressing our governance issues that have been documented by the SACS monitors. As a matter of fact, of the 11 action items, the first 5 in a very specific way dealt with perceived and real deficits that we had in terms of governance. And the governance, as it was clearly defined for me, and as I began to understand governance, not just at the board level, but throughout the district, at every level of interaction between stakeholders, internal and external. And so what I was able to do was to reach out, to do some analysis and evaluation, and I reached out to the McKenna Long and Aldrich Governance Center, which was noted and has been for many years as one of the most foremost and governance facilities, governance resources in the United States of America. And so we began to work with us immediately from my very earliest days here as your interim superintendent and the chair. You asked that I would ask them to come before the board to share with you some background as to the work that they have already done to assist the administration and to addressing many of the critical issues that we face. And I want to say in introducing them to you, many of you already know, is that they have been a critical partner in my efforts to address many of the challenges that we faced in the district. And I'm happy to report that much of the progress that we've been able to make has been greatly assisted by the men and women seated to my left. And I'm not sure who will be doing the presentation today. Oh, I get to introduce the presenter, a young man who served as my lawyer for 12 years as I served in the Georgia Department of Labor. I was former Attorney General here in the state of Georgia. And by the way, I want to add that at the end of my tenure at the Georgia Department of Labor, I can proudly say I was unindicted and unconvicted. And I expect that when I leave the DeKalb School District, I will be able to say once again that during my tenure, I was unindicted and unconvicted. And the one person who played the most significant role in that regard is an outstanding jurist, an outstanding lawyer, a person who's very familiar with us here in DeKalb County, one of our most distinguished native sons and citizens, Attorney General Thurmond Baker.
Thank you so much, Mr. Superintendent. Mr. Chairman, members of this distinguished board, staff who's here with us today, to my colleagues as well. I've been told that the best way to start any conversation is to say thank you. Thank you on a lot of different levels, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, first of all, for the great work and the service that you're doing. I have spent a lot of years in government service myself, and quite frankly, I don't know that we can say it enough to you. You all could be doing a lot of different things, and you've chosen to be here working on behalf of the children of this county. And quite frankly, I don't know that there is any higher calling that we can have than working for the kids that live in this district, in this county. So thank you so very much. Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. You were never indicted. You were never close to being indicted. I wish I could say that for others, but I can't. But I know for you, you did an outstanding job in your time as public service, and we are all so proud to see you back in this capacity and moving forward in your new role as superintendent of schools here. Let me just tell you all, first of all, how much we appreciate, those of us at McKenna Long and in the Governance Center, how much we appreciate the opportunity to have worked on this project for you. I mean, not just from a professional standpoint, but from a personal standpoint as well. As many of you know, I've lived in this county for as long as I can remember, and my wife retired as a school teacher here in DeKalb County. My youngest daughter is still teaching here in DeKalb County, and so we have a lot of interest in what goes on here and what you do. But I'm not unique. There are a lot of other people throughout DeKalb who look very closely at what you do and watch what you say and it really does make a difference, Mr. Chairman. So thank you so much for giving us the opportunity. I believe that we do have one of the better, if not the best, governance practice in the Southeast and probably in the country. And it's all because of the people who are to my right here who have worked very hard trying to give you a product that we'd all be proud of and that you would find useful. I just want to do a couple of things. I'm going to turn it over to the real head of this group in just a minute, Mr. Bill Ide. But let me take just a minute, if I can, and introduce this very distinguished group. Seated to my immediate right here is Mr. Thurmond Johnson, who comes to us with a wealth of experience both at the federal, state, and local level. And Thurmond has come in as one of our managing directors at McKenna and does a great deal of work, not just here in Georgia, but around the country. We're very glad to have him as part of our team. Many of you will know Jeremy Berry, who works on a lot of different matters. He's one of our associates at the firm, does a lot of the heavy lifting for us, has been intimately involved as well. Next to him, of course, a man who needs no introduction, Mr. Tannenblatt, who has been in government for many, many years under a lot of different governors in this state. Eric is a member of our firm, also co-chairs our public policy and regulatory affairs group. Eric, we're glad to have you here. Crystal Clark is here with us, one of our associates who've also done a lot of the heavy lifting for us in this project. Outstanding lawyer. We're glad to have her on the team. Erica Savoda as well, one of our outstanding associates, the heavy lifting for us. And then, certainly last but not least, Mr. Bill Ide. Bill comes to us as a global thinker, someone who has had experience in a lot of different capacities, working in both corporate and nonprofit environments, representing them primarily at the board levels, audit committee levels, knows more about governance principles than I will ever know. But he heads up, co-chairs our governance center at McKenna. Bill has taken this on as a personal mission. He has worked with us and teaches us every day as well about how to run government, what good government looks like, and what we all ought to be thinking about when we talk about good governance principles and best practices. But he gets it the right way. Bill was general counsel for Monsanto, a Fortune 50 company. I knew of his legend when he headed up the American Bar Association as president of the ABA. He comes to us from those kinds of experiences, and I think, to have him leading our team makes a world of difference. I want to tell you that everyone you see here in this room rolled up their sleeves and went to work, Mr. Superintendent. As you know, we were over here many days for many hours talking to your senior staff, talking to the teachers, talking to the principals, talking to anybody who would talk to us. We'd grab them out of the hallways and pull them in. We just wanted to talk, just so that we could get a sense for the issues that needed to be addressed. And I think, and what you will see, I believe, in the reports that will be presented to you tonight, that we've been able to capture many of the issues. But more importantly, working with this outstanding superintendent, we've been able to make great progress in moving forward and addressing many of the issues that were raised by SACS, but quite frankly, things that needed to be worked on even if they were not raised by SACS. And Mr. Superintendent, thank you personally for your openness, the way you've addressed these issues, and your willingness to let us sit down and to talk about these issues and to have your full support in trying to bring some correctness to problems that have been identified. So thank you. Thank this board for the opportunity, and I'm going to bring up now, if you don't mind, Mr. Bill Ide.
Thank you very much, Thurmond. You have papers in front of you. There are 2 slide decks. One I'm going to go through, which is shorter, and the other is really a summary of our report to you. It's much more detailed and gives you further exemplification of the points you want to make. And the third, which I'm going to talk about, is our proposed Statement of Government Principles, which has been adopted from best practices in the corporate world. One of the public boards I sit on, we use that, and we think that will be a great answer to SACs on most of the government's issues they raise, macro versus micro. What's the board do? What's the superintendent do? And I'll get back and talk about that. Well, it was 2001 when I retired from the Monsanto company, and by 2002 I'd flunked retirement. And my wife and I couldn't share the same phone, and she thought I need to get in office. And I looked around, I thought, well, what would be the next great adventure? And about that time, WorldCom, Enron, these things you've heard about, these corporate failures happened. Communities were destroyed. And SOX, something called Sarbanes-Oxley, was passed. And I got very interested in that. And I thought, well, how could that happen? And when you study, and you've heard the studies of Enron, they had wonderful governance principles in place, all written up, had very many talented people. And a few people overrode through the culture not being correct and caused great damage to many people. And that happened time after time in the corporate world. So corporate governance became a whole new concept, not like we knew before, and it has evolved. It's still evolving. You hear about Dodd-Frank. A lot of in there is about corporate governance. And we say, well, how could we have the financial meltdown? Why couldn't an organization catch that risk? And what has happened is, so that's my world. And I've been representing Fortune 500 corporations, getting in the middle of it. I served on 2 public boards. And what's been interesting is these concepts of best practices that have now been developed over time, particularly what's the role of the board and how can boards function well to fulfill their obligations when they're not full-time, they only meet certain times. How do you get the right information? How do you know what's really going on? And then how do you build into that with the management, if you will? And what has happened is, as these best practices have developed, and there's some wonderful companies that do it exactly right, the not-for-profit world, the university world, and yes, the government world is now also looking at that. So in 2008, you may remember Tennessee Valley Authority had $1 billion environmental spill. And the chairman of the audit committee retained me, and I went in and said, the board said, how could that have happened? $1 billion environmental spill. And so we got into it, and the first thing you have to do is you have to go out and interview everyone because they know the answer, and they know what's working and isn't working, and that's how you start. And I'm going to get into that in a minute, what we're doing here. And the answer on TVA in the end is they didn't have the right information flow. The board wasn't aware of what was really happening on down at the lower level. And I never forget interviewing the man that was in charge of construction of the dike that didn't work. And I said, did you follow the plans? And he said, no, I did it better. And now how can that happen? That when you have standards, but you have 13,000 people. How do you know each of the 13,000 people what they're doing every day and that they're doing what you want them to do? And that's what governance is all about. And so now I'm going to go into what our work has been and how we've done it. And I'm going to talk about the 2 districts. The District of Old, which we found when we came in the first part of this year, and the District of New, the district that's here today. So if I can make these slides work, there we go. When we walked in, you had the SACs threatened to accreditation. We were engaged. There were allegations of poor governance and the financial mismanagement, and it was pretty sure no one knew exactly what the numbers were and where things were. And so where we began was, first we had one superintendent just left, we had one just starting, we had a board that was preparing for a hearing whether or not they'd be suspended, and we had the stakeholders in the media just raising a lot of concerns, and frankly it was a crisis and no one was in charge. So your new superintendent rightfully worked with us and said, we need to go out and calm people down, get people talking, find out what the real problems are. And so this group, over a very short period of time, and we had 2, you have to interview correctly with like 20 to 30 people. You got to have 2 people in the room. Someone's got to say, Bill, that's what you thought you heard this, but no, it was really that. And you are a very complex business model. You're not just one little widget shop. So your stakeholders, the bus drivers better work it right or it doesn't work. Security better make it work right. Nutritionists better make it work right. Teachers better be the right people. and the parents are critical. So we had all these stakeholders. And then you had your external stakeholders. SACS had their views. We did not interview SACS, but we certainly read all their reports. And you have the state of Georgia. You have your community. We reached out to all of those. And that alone is a great stabilizer. Because if people feel they're being heard, then you can start solving problems. And so we interviewed over 130 stakeholders. Sometimes senior management, one. Sometimes teachers, principals, groups of 10 to 20. And it was very illuminating. The culture of old was a culture of mistrust, fear, communication, lack of collaboration. We have some quotes there. Things are being hidden. People feel they're not heard. Information is like a commodity of power at the central office. Kept hearing a lot about the central offices running everything. Lack of adequate systems and controls. In DeKalb, no doesn't mean no, so controls were being overridden. It's friends and family plan, great concerns about nepotism. Where does the money go? Stakeholders felt that they couldn't understand. You weren't transparent back then. It was very opaque. And a lot of turnover, and we kept hearing comments. The strategies continued to change every day. So how can I follow a business model and execute when I really don't know what the game plan was? But with those statements of concern came the constructive input. People knew the answer. I mean, how do you find out what goes in the classroom? Go to the teachers, go to the principals, go to the students, and then make your judgment of what you're hearing and reconcile it. So we worked with the superintendent. He did a great job of going out and speaking to groups. We kept feeding him input as we were going so we could know what the issues were. When he walked into one area, interpreters was a big issue. If he goes down to another area, it was completely different, that the regional superintendents had no power. So we tried to gather all those issues. And as soon as we identified issues where things were clear and they needed work, we fed them to him, and like he came to the board immediately on nepotism. That symbolism of you adopting a nepotism policy was fantastic because people felt they'd been heard. Now, how pervasive was it? I don't know. But the fact that then the board stepped forward and said, here's a policy, it was extremely helpful. And that gets under what we call the culture, which are the behavior norms. In other words, you can have written controls, written procedures, but how do people behave every day? And the kind of things we found on culture was very much command and control. I, from the top, come down and tell you, and I don't really care to hear back from you. That was the perception. Too often, at times, it was a reality where you don't get the fact-finding. So we came to you with a nepotism policy, and then the superintendent giving the signal that really we want to be bottom-up. We don't want to be top-down. Required central office personnel to serve 5 days a week at local schools, which was a wonderful thing. Because most people in the central office says, I care a lot. I don't know why I'm hearing this about the central office. We're part of the team. They're being out there 5 days a week is a huge signal, and it's a huge part of the culture you want to set. This team set up meetings with local officials, the legislature, the county commission, the governor's office. All of these people needed to hear, need to tell us. We need to hear them, and they need to hear us. We recommended a code of civility to the superintendent, which we hope you will consider. That school boards around the country have done that to try and remind people. It's the children first, and when we talk about our children, if our children were watching, how should we conduct ourselves in a civil manner so we can try and get things done. And now we are working with the superintendent on how do you build culture. In corporate America, that's a huge issue for many. I serve on the board of the superintendent's heard this too many times, Popeye's Chicken. And it's all down to the person at the counter. Are they being satisfied and provided great service? So our general counsel, our board, our HR person, they all ought to worry about that. That's the culture we're going towards. And there's some wonderful examples. Hershon, which owns theme parks, has a great culture. And Joel Mammy, the CEO, and the superintendent and I are going to meet in 2 weeks. And we say, how did you do it? Because he'll tell us, first you got to set forth your ethos, what you believe, but then you have to do training, and you ought to have to hold people accountable. And your compensation, your development plan should all include that. And it'll be a wonderful thing. So that's the kind of thing we'd identified. And then, as I mentioned, you have a very complicated, well, if I can make this slide work. All right, Crystal, where am I going? Just give me 1 second. Oh, I'm going the wrong direction. Now, that is a very busy slide. It's very hard for you to read, but let me tell you what it's attempting to do. As I said, you have a very complicated business model. So in the middle, we have put children, teachers, and parents. That's what it's all about. And then what we notice around that, everything else is trying to make that happen in the right way. So up at the top on the right, we have the superintendent and the senior staff. They're trying to drive all the needed resources into that classroom. And if you look at the bottom, it'll be hard for you to read, but you've got it on the chart in front of you. So HR and finance and operations, IT, legal affairs, their whole job is to support that middle range area. So what do I do that gets it right for the child? Frankly, this picture is not the culture we found. We were finding silos where staff functions were, I'm all about staff function, disconnected to the classroom. And so that's the model we talked to the superintendent about. And we'll talk about the board has the oversight. In the end, the board has to say, is this watch running the right way? And do I have the right metrics that tells me that the performance that we need, are the buses running on time? Is the food being done right? Is security? All those areas will feed up to the board in some reportable fashion, because you can't go do it yourself, and that's the macro versus the micro. So all of these people, we did interview each of these areas, but that's the total focus is all the resources work well to support that student. So now I'll move on to strategy. We reported back to the superintendent things we found, people suggestions that made a lot of sense. And so decision making was, instead of top down, decentralized more, make it closer to the customer, if you will, which is the student, the parent, and the teacher. The Success for All program had not worked well, and so in the opinion of the people involved, so the superintendent eliminated that. $500,000 was spent to rehire interpreters. That had been cut. And when we went out and interviewed, it was clearly a serious problem for those communities. Principals are now working on reestablishing parent centers, now establishment of career academy. Those are things now being put in place and working along. You have your strategic plan. There was a 90-day plan that you've already received. Bus operations, the superintendent got our feedback, met with them. They helped him solve the problem, so buses don't get lost because they're going to have their little GS Pathfinder. And then we spent time, excuse me, that was, let me go to talent first. We gave feedback after our interviews, and you would interview one person, you would get an evaluation, but you would also get input from that person about other people, and then you kept trying to put all that together and then give that feedback. And so there was an evaluation focusing on the competency of the people and their dedication to the mission and their culture fit. And personnel changes have been made by the superintendent that help refine, particularly that eliminating the top-down command and control. And I think you now have the culture of today, and the district of today is very oriented to the schoolroom and for bottom-up empowerment. And finance and audit, we met with your CFO, we met with the superintendent and other people. You're getting much greater transparency and collaboration. People now can follow the numbers. Your budget approval process is now much more understandable and not bringing surprises, which unfortunately had happened in the past. You're rebuilding your reserves and your fund balance. Expect a positive balance in 2013. You've got the audit of the old district, but you're going to show a contrast to the new district. That is going to be a new day. And Your recommended budget for 2014 is focusing on the needs of the classroom. So things are really shaping up in that area. Risk compliance. This gets to Dodd-Frank and Wall Street. How in the world could that have ever happened? So risk is a big thing. Just think about IT. It's a lot of money. If you get it right, you save a lot of money. If you get it wrong, it costs you a lot of money. So those are the kinds of things the board needs to know about and say what are the real risks and what are the considerations back and forth. And we've recommended, they call it enterprise risk management, an ERM, a process for the board, and you'll see that in the back of our processes. But you are installing best and practice governance at the superintendent down level. I call that implementation level, and I'll show you a little bit more about that. And you've reduced legal expenses. We spent some time with the superintendent talking about the Hearing litigation. Congratulate the superintendent. He's a heck of a negotiator, and the board. We've given an analysis for the superintendent to consider on how to best utilize. I was general counsel. We did have inside lawyers, outside lawyers. What's the right balance? What's the best way to get the most efficiencies? So we've given our analysis on that. And then I think the bridge initiative is terribly exciting, and a lot of the feedback we got is now being addressed, of concern is now being addressed, because the mission, and we believe, and that you're pursuing, is every child is taken to their full potential. No two children are the same, but what's the full potential of that child? And is this district taking them there? And we think the Bridge Initiative is a very exciting development on that front. In the governance areas, governance is, yes, at the board level, but it's also at the superintendent. It's throughout the organization. And at the governance level, we're working with the superintendent on metrics to then get you the scorecard. So what needs to be measured and how are you going to know outcomes? First, we ought to get that right so he knows what the metrics are, and he has people giving him the information flow so he can get it to you. The governance principles which you have in front of you, and we would commend that to you for adoption at a future board meeting, we believe takes head on the SAC's, many of the SAC's concerns about governance, because it clarifies what the board's role is, what the superintendent's role is, and how the appropriate balance is between macro versus micro. SACS was nice enough to make a positive mention about us in their progress report, so we were appreciative of that. So the next slide, again, well, you have it in front of you, easier to read. The main point we're pointing out here is governance has two pieces to that. You have the oversight, which is the board, and then you have carrying out the will of the board, the implementation. And we've been spending, what we discovered is when we came in, that the implementation phase was not in place. There weren't the proper systems and controls and culture so that you could get the right information, so nor could the superintendent. So that's where we spent the time initially, is getting that right. And we now believe that best practices are in place. This takes time. It'll take 12 to 18 months for all of this to snap together, particularly on the culture piece. You're asking 13,000 people to sort of think of new ways of doing, and some will probably have to leave. And it takes time to work through that. I know at Monsanto, when we went through that, I remember our head of HR saying, here is our culture. Some of you may not be comfortable with that. And we understand that, but you probably should go somewhere else, because this is the way we are and this is who we are. And so that will take time, because you're about a culture of empowerment, you're about a culture of listening, servitude, and not everyone has a personality that can fit into that. But this is, and then on the board oversight, we'll get to in just a minute. Then the next slide, that's the point I've already made, that we've been focusing with the administration, and we do believe that the District of New is moving in the right direction, and a lot of progress has been made. And then so looking ahead, which gets to the oversight function of the board, the matter that I've already talked about a number of times is the governance principles we think are ripe for your next board meeting for you to consider, and I think that'll address many of the SAC's concerns. And then we set forth in the more comprehensive deck I have for you what we believe best practices are at the board level. And we break it down to the board's responsibility is talent. You have the right people. You have the right superintendent. How are you evaluating? How are you compensating? And then how about the whole system? So talent, strategy. What's your business model? What are you trying to achieve? And how are you going to get there? Finance. You got to know your numbers. You got to make sure that you're spending the money where you think you need to. Risk. Would have been nice in 2007 if you all had known the bubble was going to burst, and therefore you build reserves and not counted on much of the ad valorem tax. That's the kind of thing you have to start thinking about on risk. Governance. Is everything working? So constantly you have to sort of tweak with governance. Compliance. Always want to follow the law and make sure, and then culture. So those that we talk about, those I'm not talking with you tonight because you've already made great progress, but we do think that there are things that will snap in now with the superintendent bringing up to you the systems information control that you can hook into. As I said to the TVA board, you could push a button and pull a lever and nothing would happen because you weren't connected. So that is our presentation. We're pleased to answer any questions that you might have.
Mr. Coleman.
Thanks very much for coming today. I'm not sure if this is on.
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for coming out today.
I can really hear you.
Now you can really hear me. I had two questions, I guess. The first would be, this is great, and thanks for reviewing progress. Progress is something we're glad to see. Obviously, our focus moving forward has to be those areas where we can kind of continue to make progress, where we haven't addressed gaps. If you had to identify a couple of areas of focus for us now where we need to kind of continue to push to address outstanding gaps, do you have a sense for what those would be if you were in our seats?
The first would be to oversee culture and make sure that that's happening. That's because you want those 13,000 people. When I first ran on the culture, my CEO at Monsanto brought together the senior team. He says, you all are really bright, talented people, and you're about at 60% as a group efficient. I'd like to get you up to at least 70, 75, and that's culture. How can you work together? How can you be more efficient? And so the superintendent is getting up a game plan, but on culture, that's going to take training, and that's going to take. So that's one, because when you think about it, if you go to a Hertz or you go to McDonald's, no matter where in the world, you expect the same level of performance and the same smile, and that's what you want. You want of your 13,000 people, and so that's a big effort. Now that's more the board overseeing, and then the other, as quickly as possible for you, are metrics. So in each of these areas, what's the right conversation? You know, what's the scorecard that I ought to be concerned about? We do this work for the Port Authority in New York, New Jersey, and when we showed up, they had this great frustration between the board and staff because they didn't know what to talk about. So staff said, you're micromanaging, you're going to accounts receivable, and the board says, well, you're hiding the ball. I can say this, it was all public. And what we did is we brought out ERM and said, well, what are the 5 drivers of success for the Port Authority? So for you, what are the most critical things that keeps your superintendent up at night? You know, that you want to know those, and then you want to track them and say, well, what are we doing about them? So those would be the two. If you ask me two, those would be the two.
And I guess my follow-up question is actually related to that second point, which is on metrics. You had mentioned you guys were thinking about a scorecard. I know we're doing that in the context of strategic planning as well. And so this may be for one or both of you. You know, what's the timeline on that, and what's the best way for us to engage as we shape the early process of that scorecard? Because I know it's part of the strategic plan, but it's also a part that probably we're going to develop over time. Have you had conversations about that? And if so, you know, what do you think the timeline is on that, and how can we participate productively in shaping it?
I'll answer, and as you know, Mr. Coleman, the strategic planning process is ongoing, and it's always important for organizations, institutions, agencies to engage in that process, because we've labored for nearly a decade but not an engaged, workable strategic plan. And the question that you raised is going to be a critical component of that, and hopefully with the assistance of Mr. Hyde and the board and stakeholders, we'll be able to clearly define the work and how to measure the work. so that you as board members and stakeholders will be able to evaluate our success or lack thereof. And that was an issue that we found. You know, individuals were dissatisfied, rightly so, but we couldn't clearly define the nature of the dissatisfaction, or as to whether or not you should actually be dissatisfied, or how much for that matter. And one of the things that we've been able to do, which is always critical, is to establish the baseline as to where we are, and to acknowledge whatever deficits we've had, and then begin to build the processes that can help us do a better job. And the Bridge Initiative, just as it relates to academic achievement, I think, Mr. Hyde said, most critical, because by utilizing the data, we begin to understand that not all of our children are failing. We are not a failing school district. That there are students enrolled in our district that are having greater challenges than others, but now we're in a much better position to identify those students, and more importantly, identify a strategy that not just look at achievement, but also growth. And that's the most revolutionary aspect of what we're doing right now, is that we will be able to, going forward with our universal screener, to really begin to focus on not just achievement, but also growth, and to celebrate our students who grow, as well as our teachers and leaders who help assist in that growth. That's just something we could not do. We were a winner-take-all game. Either you're here or you're there. But the reality is there's a wide area in between that we can impact in a very positive way. But as Bill said, we just couldn't recognize it. It was blind. And we didn't have any ability to acknowledge it and then to build on it, if that makes sense.
If I could just build on that, in general, from a governance point of view, first you pick your areas the board ought to care about, you know, and obviously students is a huge one, but so is safety, you know, and I could go to, so is IT, and then you hit this challenge of if you can't measure it, you don't know it, and people say, oh, well, you can't measure that. Well, you really can, and so you pick the areas, and then you say, what's the process of the evaluation, and what am I going to measure, how I'm going to measure it, and then how do I get the data? And I think as the superintendent develops that, there are going to be policy questions that the board will want to be involved with, like, well, are you measuring the right things? You know, I need to know about that. And then, you know, it's going to be, I expect if you go around to different school districts, you're going to get different perspectives on what's success with students. And so you'll want to know, well, what are the different approaches, and so that, and it will take, this is hard, it will take time, because the superintendent is rebuilding or building anew, if you will, a system. So it will take some time. But I think if we can help get to you an outline of the game plan, then you can start filling it in, you know, and put timelines on it as you go.
Mr. Orson.
Right. How are you today?
Doing great.
A lot here, and this is not comprehensive by any means. I've sort of gone through this quickly. I had a couple of questions for you, sort of preliminarily. It was focused on governance principles. I wanted to ask you about three things.
Marshall, if you don't mind, put your mic closer.
Okay, can you hear? Is that better? I wanted to ask you about some of the things in the document about the governance principle. And it's just really to understand a little bit better about where you're coming from and whether, and I very much appreciate the model that of using kind of corporate governance models as an example, but, you know, we obviously, because we're also a political body, we have that sort of corresponding balance there. And when you talk about things like success, and which I'm very encouraged by the growth model, because finally the education establishment is getting to understand that it's about where you are getting to. But we also have a lot of externalities that control those definitions because of who funds us and the rules they set and all those things that aren't always applicable from the business environment. So finding that balance. But the three questions I just had for the moment. The first was on page 4, which was about board committees. And your reference there about choosing to create standing committees in the future, which obviously we have done the opposite, in part because best practices in the education field have indicated that standing committees have tended to lead to a siloing effect of board members feeling they had control over the particular area, and that was specifically addressed by the SACS review of our district, that we had one of the longest histories. And when you look around the other metro area school districts, they have moved away. They've moved to a committee of the whole structure like this. And so I wanted to sort of trying to get an understanding about how this is in here and what your thinking was, given that the current practices, particularly around school boards, seem to be moving in the opposite direction.
Well, okay, and then the reason we put may is we know what Zach said.
Right.
But what my experience is that at Clark AU, for instance, which we had the Sachs issue, culture is the key thing. If you have a culture where the board committees are sharing and getting the information out, that's a lot different than I don't know what's going on with the committees. But the problem I see, the reason I push the committee concept, subject to SAC's approval, is an audit committee that is so detailed. So if you do it right, you've got to really dig in. And there'll be certain people that ought to be on the audit committee because it's just like that. I've been putting on audit committees. I think get me out of here because I'm just not that good on numbers. You get to buildings and grounds, you know, and I'm over at CAU now. So I personally think that it's a best use efficiency for the board to have committees and do the deep dives, but to make sure that the board fully understands. What you're talking about in the corporate world was the comp committee never told the rest of the board what they're paying the CEO. And that caused huge problems.
Right, and I understand that in terms of the corporate world, but
Yeah.
the particulars of the SACS findings, and again, the
Yeah.
practices in other school systems has been that there has been a great tendency that those on the committee do that deep dive, and it's not just the lack of sharing information, it's the lack of engagement, or if everybody's engaged, what's the point of having those committees? Because it's either one or the other, and then
Yeah.
particularly in a setting in which we're a policy body, you know, the whole theories, the Carver theories about policy governance, move to the idea that, you know, the committee of the whole, they don't even love committees of the whole, quite frankly, the Carvers, but, you know, putting that aside, the idea that the shared experience of the board at one time in terms of receiving information and deliberating over it, at least, you know, and I certainly appreciate your thoughts on it, but certainly it seems to be contrary to what the direction has been, and clearly the belief of our own accrediting agency, not only specific to our school system, but as a general principle about how school systems, and I would argue that, you know, a private university and a public school system, while similar, aren't exactly the same in terms of their structure. But just a discussion. Two other small ones.
Sure.
At the top of page 3, in the point that's carried over from point 2, and this may just be about language, and you talk about frequent board meetings, you know, and that sort of gives me pause because, again, out of the Sachs report, one of the criticisms was the frequency of our meetings as a sign of our dysfunction, not our function. You know, and I think we've tried to move to a model of what I would call regular board meetings, regular periodic board members,
Yeah.
so there's predictability about when we're going to be engaged with the public, as opposed to, quite frankly, the experience of Dr. Johnson, Mr. McMahon, and myself of meeting 3 times a week, every week for the first 2 months we were on this board. You know, I don't mean to suggest that that's your suggestion, but
No.
I'm trying to get at some definition about what you mean around frequent board meetings in terms of that.
Well, I think it is semantics, and I think this has to be tailored to where you are and how you feel about the rhythm, because this was, you know, boards go through different eras.
Right.
When I had to restate on one board, audit committee met every week. We were in a crisis. Now we meet every 4 months. So that language could be changed. That was not to suggest.
Okay. I thought that I know
Yeah.
these documents. My last question, which is the 1, 2, 3.
I thought
4.
you weren't practicing law anymore.
All right. I have to practice somewhere else. That's the thing. The 6th bullet point on page 3, and this is really just a small point, but you talk about, and I agree, about board members receiving materials in advance of the meetings. And I think one of the things we struggle with is what does that timetable look like for us to be effective in exercising our governance responsibilities. And that's not to be, the staff is under tremendous pressure. People are coming at them 100 directions, and we're a huge organization with lots of things. But I think one of the things we're still struggling with is what's a best practice in there in order for us to be effective, acknowledging that there are emergencies and things get added to agendas. I think we are still a little bit fluid on that subject. Getting guidance from your experience would really be helpful.
Well, I have strong feelings on this one. I've been on both sides because I used to set the agenda for the board as Secretary at Monsanto. And we finally told the senior management, you cannot show up 2 days before a board meeting, and we're not going to act on your items. When they finally got it, they started planning better. So I do think for a board to be effective, you have to have time to read things and absorb it. Not only read it, but you may have some questions, then you want to make a phone call. So I would push pretty heavy that you have to have the materials in advance and just,
Want to give us a number so we can, how many days? 7, 10, 15?
Superintendent can't kick that far over to me, so I'm okay.
Well, one of the things, and I want to share with you just in terms of the relationship, and I compliment MLA for it. At the end of the day, they provide information. As it relates to the superintendent, it's up to me to make the decision.
Right.
And what I've said to them is to be as honest and as forthright as you can in providing the information. The board has hired me to do the job of the superintendent, as all the voters have elected you to be a board member. So those are decisions once you have the information. What has hurt us is that we've been afraid to engage the broad range of information available. Because we have preconceived notions as to what's right and what's wrong, then oftentimes individuals will hesitate to engage or access new information. So one of the, I think, the added value added with this, and to be honest with you, I can't say all or more or less, but much of the information I didn't follow. Because at the end of the day, based on the information and the facts and the reality of the superintendent, y'all hired me to do the job. You didn't hire MLA to do the job. But you hired me to get as much information so that I can make informed decisions that you all will accept or reject. So that, I think, Mr. Orson, is not so much do this, but this is something you can consider as a board member, accept it or reject it, but consider it.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, and so, and that's really the relationship, and I think that's what's missing, is that, number one, we avoid preconceived ideas. And coming into DeKalb, one of the first things I had to do was to erase any preconceived notion I had, and then allow the data and the facts to drive decision making. That's a huge challenge in a human being, right? Because we all come with our life experiences. We know who we like, we know who we don't like when we get here with the agenda. But in order to be successful, you have to almost step out of your body. It's all right, what are the facts? And that's what was so important here. I didn't have the facts. And so I needed help in generating facts so I could make more informed, objective decisions about direction. Then reject or accept.
So anyway, so Mr. Ive, thank you to you and your team, and we appreciate the work that you do.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayfield, and then Dr. Morley.
I'm going to try to simplify this question as best I can, but it does have 3 dimensions to it. But it does center around the whole issue of culture. And just sort of as a soapbox statement, if you will, I do believe that a lot of the comments and questions and emails that we get from the public in general tends to imply, or question rather, whether or not there is a certain level of competency in the district. And so a lot of those questions, I believe, really don't have merit with respect to the competency of the individuals, but perhaps the culture is defining the behavior of the individuals so that the output looks like there's a gap between their ability to perform and what the district needs. I hope that statement makes sense. So my question actually centers around page 8 of the presentation, the illustration. And I guess maybe first as sort of as a qualifying question, I'm going to assume that the diagram is sort of a standard diagram for what this should look like, not necessarily what it does look like, and that depending on the district and the nature of the needs of that district, some of the boxes around the circles could be different.
That's correct.
Right. So given that, but recognizing the statement that you made that the culture of the system now is one of stovepipe, but this is actually our business environment. What would you say would be the primary catalyst for us to consider, to change the culture from the stovepipe culture to recognizing this as the business environment? And what should be the board's role in facilitating?
Well, I think the superintendent has made great progress because he's gone out and he's empowered people. And what the stovepipe is, a sort of a command and control where each at the top function was sort of pushing down. So the glass has been broken, the new tone is set. So that part is great. But you're going to hear, well, can you walk the talk? Because with 13,000 people, you've got to institutionalize that. The superintendent can't be at every school and every bus and every place. So that's going to take training and it's going to take time. And what the board's critical about is they have to, and something should be written up. At least typically what you do, corporations and others, is they sort of write their value system, or et cetera. And then you start, senior management all gathers and they say, I'll buy them. Because what you want is, we believe, an empowerment, service, I'm a listener, you're important, and you cascade it down. And then what the superintendent has done is good is, I think teachers today really believe in when they say what you have to say is important and we want your feedback. But that will take time to get it 13,000 people doing that. And the board should say, okay, Mr. Superintendent, I got it. Here we agree on the mission. You've shown me their training. Now let's have metrics as we go. Who's got trained? When do they get trained? What's your system for holding people accountable? And then sort of a survey now and then to the parents and to employees. Is it working? Do you feel respected? Do you feel like that you're an important part of the team? So that's about a 18 to 24 month rollout, but you've already made a lot of progress because it's funny. One of the quotes, I don't know, we put it in there, when the superintendent helped us set up who we go see. And with feedback we got from one of them was, when the former Attorney General of Georgia walked in to hear what I had to say, I knew the superintendent was serious. But think about that. You're a bus driver, and in comes a former superintendent and says, you're important. Tell me what's going on and what's not working. So that's a huge signal. And people started talking. We could tell. First interviews were people, by the time we got going, well, this is for real. So I think you've already made a great step, but the winds could blow over everything you've done if you don't institutionalize it and put processes in place.
Dr. Marley?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of piggyback on what the superintendent was saying. I think it's so important that remember that we all do have roles, and if the board were to stay in his lane, the superintendent is allowed to stay in his lane and to lead the organization. The board is here to govern. And one of the things I appreciate that this data that you provided for us, I think is so critical, and for the work that you've done along with the superintendent, because it does provide a guideline. But what we have to remember is that it is a process. It's not an event. It's going to take some time. We're still limping and trying to get back on track for the things that didn't take place before, and it is going to take some time. But at the same time, we cannot be, and I don't think we want to be, cookie cutters of every other district that's around. We have to begin to look at, in many ways, we're an anomaly to other systems, and so we have to look at what is best for us, what is best for us as a board, what is best for us as a system, actually trying to reach the goal of educating children, helping children to be successful academically and otherwise. So I don't think that we can have you all come in and saying, you have to do it this way, do it that way. This is why this board is here, in order to govern and in order to decide what does it take in order for us to go in the direction we need to go. But at the same time, allowing this leader to lead and not trying to micromanage and do those sorts of things. So I hear a lot of that coming out of this document, and basically giving an overview of what you've seen and what you have heard, and now where we're going in the future, because of the fact that we have gotten off track of what was there before. And I think the major thing is recognizing that there were problems. We're trying to fix the problems. It's going to take some time. But again, we cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's being systematically looking at everything that's going on and coming up with a plan. And I really think that we're there. I think that we're doing a lot, but it's still going to take some time. But I don't want us to be a cookie-cutter system, because, Gwinnett is not like DeKalb. APS is not like DeKalb. We are our own. We can look at what are best practices, as you're saying, but at the same time, what's best for us? I think that we have to begin to do that. And when we can do that, allow the superintendent to lead, allow him to lead his staff, we govern the way we're supposed to do, I think that we'll be on the right track. And as time goes by, those months and those years will get better at what we're doing.
If I could just add to that, what I've said to the superintendent is our goal for you, our dream for you is that you'll be the national model. And the practices we're bringing you are not from other districts. We're bringing you national best practices on how best to run an entity. A lot of it's from the private sector, but some of it's from governments that are doing it well. So we've looked nationally.
Mr. Superintendent, Dr. Irwin, I'm sorry. Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I just had one quick question. Looking at the poor communication, at what level within the system do we have the greatest amount of dysfunction when it came to poor communication?
Well, what you had in the old district was you had top down, which meant I'm telling you what to do, and I really don't want to engage in any communications about it.
Or was it just a brick wall?
That was the sense of it, and parents had the same sense of it. That at the local level, I was powerless.
Mr. Superintendent, if I may, I think this is an excellent report. I hear you saying that you respect the findings, and certainly you want to adhere to those that fit and make some appropriate decisions based on the information that you gathered. What I would like to see, and I think it may be a benefit to the board, after you analyze the entire report and decide on the directions that you want to focus based on this report, is to have a board retreat so that we all can understand what parts of it you want to put in your plan as a superintendent, and then we have an opportunity to engage and collaborate on the efforts so we all will know the direction that we're going and moving, if that's okay with
I
you.
think it's an excellent idea, Mr. Chairman, and we are looking at some preliminary times, hopefully before the end of the year, when we can sit down with yourself and the members of the board and now begin really the real work. We talked earlier. You can't really make these long-term strategic decisions in crisis. You have to really settle or resolve or at least tame the crisis so that it gives this board time to look more deliberately at some of the data and the long-term strategic decision that must have been made. But we're in a district that's been in a crisis for at least 4 to 5 straight years. And so this is a blessing to be able to have a meeting and just to have the discussion. And we do it and we talk to the senior staff. So I think in preparing now for the work, as I talked to you earlier, the real work is improving the achievement and the growth in our students. Everything we have done so far today was really just a prelude to the battle. This is normal, and now we're getting ready to go on the beach. Everything else led us up to this point for D-Day. And now we're preparing for D-Day in the sense of really getting to the central focus and mission of a school district, and that is to improve growth and achievement in our students. Or, as we're beginning to say, in our community of learners, because one of the things that the team really came to understand is that we got to educate and train not just students, but teachers and parents and stakeholders, all of us school board members. We had to learn how to become a school board member. We didn't know. Some of the models that we had been utilizing and emulating were basically just wrong-headed and destructive. So even as a superintendent and school board members are now learners because we are learning what it means to be a school board member. And now you got to inform the broader community because many of them voted or appointed based on what they thought a school board member should be as opposed to what the law suggests that a school board member is, and it comes back to government. So I'm excited, and I think we're on a good place. And we can now get to what I think are the critical issues facing public education in Georgia. And it's not just DeKalb either. Public education in Georgia and in America.